hysterical move today to eliminate Confederate symbols from the American landscape springs from the myth taught for 2 generations that the South seceded to protect slavery while the North invaded to abolish slavery. The claim is as preposterous as it is popular. No national political party in the entire antebellum period ever put forth a proposal to emancipate slaves. And Lincoln and Congress repeatedly made clear that emancipation was not the reason for invasion. All this talk about slavery as the cause of the war is a smokescreen to hide the stark immorality of the North's invasion. The South did not secede over policy questions regarding slavery, the tariff, Western Territory, or any other policy. The South seceded for the simple reason that it wanted to govern itself and was capable of doing so. No one wastes time today wondering whether Scotland or Catalonia or the colonies in 1776 really had good policy reasons for secession. Their desire for self-government and their ability to do it was a sufficient reason. The question, therefore, that historians should be asking, and which is the only question they ask, is why? Why did the South secede? But they should be asking, why did the North invade? There would have been no war had the North not invaded the South. This question is suppressed because an honest answer to it would not be morally attractive. Historians have yet to confront the hard moral truth that the best solution to all the problems facing the Union in 1861, including the moral problem of slavery, was a negotiated division into 2 federations. Now, what sort of government did Southerners hope to enjoy by secession? The answer is to be found most clearly stated in the Confederate Constitution. It gives mute testimony to their reasons. But it is important to understand that this Constitution was not a new Constitution. The Southerners took with them the original Constitution, which they dearly loved, and they amended it in certain respects. Now, what positive good did these reforms seek to achieve? And what bad things did those reforms seek to avoid? In order to answer this question, we must keep in mind that we here have all inherited 2 incompatible visions of America, which I shall symbolize as Jeffersonian America and Lincolnian America. Now, I treat these as timeless symbols, which means that there were Lincolnians before Lincoln, for example, Hamilton, and there were Jeffersonians before Jefferson, the Anti-Federalists. But these will serve as symbols. These incompatible visions were intimated from the first. They clashed in the bloodiest war of the 19th century, and they are still with us today, unabated. Stripped to the essentials, the division is this. And I'm just going to talk about the constitutional division. There are other divisions too, but for the Jeffersonians, the Constitution is a compact between sovereign states creating a central government to which they delegated only a few enumerated powers, foreign treaties, defense, and so on. All other powers, religion, education, healthcare, marriage, and the like, are reserved to the states, period. Madison said, for example, that a state could interpose to protect its citizens from federal intrusion into its reserved powers. And Jefferson said, quote, nullification was the, quote, rightful remedy, end quote, to federal usurpation. And if need be, he said, the state could lawfully, not through revolution, but lawfully secede from the Union. It could do these things, though, only if it was a sovereign political society. You have to believe that. The Lincolnian vision flatly denies that the states are or ever were sovereign political societies. It holds that sovereignty is vested in the American people in the aggregate, and that the Constitution is not a compact between the states, but a national constitution where the central government has plenary power over individuals, and where the states are conceived as counties and a unitary state. And Lincoln explicitly says that in one of his speeches. Now, if the states are like counties, then Lincoln is absolutely right that a state cannot lawfully nullify an act of the central government, nor can it lawfully secede from the Union, any more than a county can. The county of DeKalb in Georgia can't lawfully withdraw from the Union or lawfully nullify an act of the legislature. So you see the difference. It's stark. Now, what we have forgotten, and this is important, is this Jeffersonian vision of America dominated North and South from 1776 to 1861. In other words, Jeffersonian America was America. The Lincolnian vision came to rule only after the defeat of the Confederacy. But what exactly was the character of this Jeffersonian America that dominated and that the South was fighting for? Because it just wanted to continue that. Jefferson's election was known as, quote, the Revolution of 1800. It was a revolution because it was in opposition to the centralizing tendencies of the Washington and Adams administrations. Jeffersonians believed that the best way to prevent tyranny is to limit the central government's power to raise and spend money. That's where the problem is. Earlier, the Anti-Federalists, believing the same, had urged that original taxing power be denied to the central government and left to the states. Now, they failed to get this into the Constitution, but Jefferson became the champion of these Anti-Federalists, and he ran for president on a platform to abolish all inland federal taxes, and he succeeded. From Jefferson's election until the secession of South Carolina, December 20th, 1860, Americans paid no inland taxes to the federal government except for a brief period of taxation to pay for the War of 1812. The government could impose such taxes, but politically they were prevented from doing so. Jefferson also inveighed against public credit. He urged reforms in which future generations would have a lawful way to repudiate debts imposed on them by profligate spending of earlier generations. He also sought to get the central government out of debt. In this he did not succeed, but another Jeffersonian, Andrew Jackson, did succeed. He destroyed the Bank of the United States in 1835. Which would be the equivalent of destroying the Federal Reserve today. For the first time in its history, the central government of the United States was out of debt. And it stayed close to that goal up to 1861, except for an easily managed debt to cover the Mexican War, which was only $65 million. Less than the total expenditures of the federal government in 1858. That was the debt. That was Jeffersonian America. The central government's expenditure on the eve of Lincoln's invasion of the South was less than 2% of GNP. Today, it is around 40%. And much of state and local taxation is tied to federal regulations and mandates. This spectacular shift of power from the states to the central government is a consequence of what we might call the Lincolnian Revolution of 1865, which overthrew the Jeffersonian Revolution of 1800. Now, there had never been anything in the world like Jeffersonian America. It was an amazing regime. For example, modern states are self-centralizing regimes, and they naturally expand centralized political and economic power. This is what they do. They grow in centralization. Jeffersonian Americanism, however, is unique in that its central government actually diminished in centralization. The states also were frugal in taxation and regulations, not just the central government. To take an example, the corrupt Reconstruction government in Florida in 1869 paid more for printing, for its session of government, paid more for printing than the cost of the state government in 1860. The annual sessions of the Louisiana legislature had averaged, prior to 1860, $100,000 a year. Under Lincolnian Republican rule during Reconstruction, they averaged around $1 million a year. White Americans arguably enjoyed more individual and political liberty in 1861 than any people in the world then or since. Let me say that again. Jeffersonian Americans enjoyed more individual and political liberty than any people in the world then or since. Whereas the people of Europe were burdened with taxes and loaded with debt, Americans paid hardly any federal taxes and were virtually free of federal debt. Europeans stood in fear of large standing armies possessed by centralized monarchies. Americans had no such fears because the sword was in the hands of state militias. Jeffersonian political economy sought to frame the constitutional rules to provide a wide distribution of landed property in order to afford citizens economic and economic independence. A wide distribution of landed property. In contrast, Lincolnian political economy, as far back as Hamilton, tried to rig the rules to effect economic and political centralization by uniting financial and commercial wealth with the central government through a public debt and a cartel of private banks chartered to manage the money supply. I mean, the Federal Reserve is like the Politburo. It just tells you what money's going to cost, what the price is. It's the same thing. In short, the Lincolnian regime was intended to be a regime of large-scale crony capitalism. Now, crony capitalism is a very good thing if you're a part of it. And you could say it's for the national good, or whatever you want to say, or for the kingdom of God, or whatever. But it's still crony capitalism. But crony capitalism, though it began with Hamilton and so on, it was suppressed throughout the antebellum period by the Jeffersonian regime, whose program was largely in place after some battles by 1860. Well, let's look at it. In wealth, Jeffersonian America equaled that of Europe, though much of it was still frontier. And it was more evenly distributed wealth. Its literacy rate was higher than any country in the world, as was the number of its youth going to college. Those who aspired to a Republican government in Europe saw Jeffersonian America as a model to emulate. Switzerland, for example, changed its constitution in 1848 from a loose confederation to a federal system of states in emulation of Jeffersonian America. Indeed, the Swiss went further than the Jeffersonians in denying to the central government any original taxing power. Switzerland has 26 little states called cantons, and they really are states. They range from 18,000 to about 1 million in population. But the average is around 300,000. Even today, the Swiss central government may tax only for a certain period of time and at a certain rate. After that period of time has lapsed, it has no taxing power whatsoever. The power can be renewed only by a constitutional amendment requiring a majority of the cantons and a majority of individuals. Switzerland was in 1848 was a Jeffersonian outpost in Europe, surrounded by monarchies. And it still is a Jeffersonian outpost in Europe, and we're not. Another federation influenced by Jeffersonian America is Canada, that peaceable kingdom to our north. The Canadian provinces have the constitutional right of state nullification and secession. A Canadian province may nullify within its borders any federal law in the area of civil rights. You can just opt out. And every Canadian province has a right to a public referendum on secession at taxpayers' expense whenever it wishes. Both of these are denied to Americans under the Lincolnian vision. Now, how Canada got these rights is an interesting story. Judah Benjamin, the brilliant Jewish Secretary of State in the Confederacy, fled to England after the war and became a distinguished barrister. He took up and won a number of cases for the Canadian Parliament, provinces, before the Imperial Court. And as a result, winning these cases, Jeffersonian states' rights principles were placed into Canadian common law. A Canadian senator, we both wrote books on Hume, that's how we got to be friends, John Stewart, once told me, there's a saying in Canada that the South, having lost the war in America, won it in Canada, where nullification and secession can be discussed most every day without people going crazy. Very interesting. What I have called Jeffersonian America was characteristic of North and South up to 1861. There was resistance, but it dominated. But it was the South that provided most of America's moral and political leadership up to that period, from 1776 to 1861. Just consider this. As of 1861, the South produced 9 presidents, the North 6. But more important, 5 Southern presidents served 2 terms. No Northern president ever served 2 terms. In the first 64 years, 51 of those were under Southern presidents. You see why New England felt oppressed. No, that number would be higher, most likely, if Polk had not imposed on himself a rule to serve only 1 term. Had Zachary Taylor not died in office, Millard Fillmore would not have been president. And it is likely that William Crawford would have won against John Quincy Adams in 1824 had he not suffered a stroke during the election. If these things had happened, then in the first 64 years, only 8 years would be under Northern presidents. Southerners created Jeffersonian America. Look at attorney generals from the South, 14, the North 5. Supreme Court justices, 17, the North 11. Speakers of the House, the South, 21, the North 12. Southerners were crucial in securing independence from Britain and in forming the Constitution. All the territory acquired by the United States beyond the original 13 states was acquired by Southern administrations. As of 1860, the United States was very much a Jeffersonian regime, governed largely by Southerners. It begins to change in the 50s, but that's what it is the first 64 years. Now, there's a myth propagated by New England elites in the early 19th century that Southerners were lazy, ignorant, and generally poor when compared to industrious New England. Although English historian Michael O'Brien and a number of other scholars have soundly refuted the myth, it is still fixed in the popular imagination, especially in that of Southerners themselves, who sometimes readily identify with the redneck image. Talk about Stockholm Syndrome. Consider the following, though. Nobel laureate Robert Fogel co-authored with Stanley Engelman a study of the economics of the Old South titled Time on the Cross, which I recommend. They showed that white Southern agriculture was actually more productive than Northern. White agriculture, more productive. And that plantation agriculture was more productive than either. The South in 1861 had the fourth largest economy in the world. The first commercially successful railway line in America was built in Charleston, South Carolina in 1830. It was called the Best Friend of Charleston. It ran 136 miles and was the largest railroad line in the world at that time. Pretty backward, right? As of 1861, the South had more miles of railroad than any country in the world except the North. Fogel and Engelman point out that this superior productivity of white Southern agriculture over Northern attests to the high level of Southern entrepreneurship. They also observe that the superior productivity of plantation agriculture, as opposed to white Northern or Southern agriculture, was not possible without educating, training, and giving considerable responsibility to the black labor force. The authors argue that slaves were encouraged to increase production not through the crack of the lash, but through pecuniary incentives and promotion to positions of status. They claim that most overseers were probably slaves. Some planters indeed left management of the entire plantation to slaves who purchased supplies, planted, harvested, and sold the crops, with the owner receiving a certain amount of the profits. Ben Montgomery, for example, was one of these. He managed the plantation of Jefferson Davis, his brother. He was taught many skills, including land surveying and architecture. He invented an ingenious propeller for steamships, but was denied a patent from the U.S. Patent Office because he was a slave. He was again denied the patent after the war when he was not a slave. By contrast, Jefferson Davis got a bill passed. Jefferson Davis tried to get his patent for him before the war, and that failed. But anyway, during the war, Davis got passed in the Confederate Congress a bill which allowed slaves to receive patents for their inventions. The 1860 census shows that the South greatly outranked the northern states in per capita income. Now, this is almost difficult to believe, but you can look at the census yourself. The 12 highest annual per capita income states were all in the South, all of them, the 12 highest. The highest was Mississippi with an annual per capita income of $2,128 a year. South Carolina, $2,017. The highest northern state, the highest, was Connecticut with $771, a little more than 1/3 that of Mississippi. New York's share was $597, less than 1/3 that of Mississippi. In South Carolina, Mississippi and South Carolina. The poorest southern state was Arkansas at $881, which was higher than any northern state. Even if slaves are counted in the average of income earners, only 3 northern states make it to the top 12, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Oregon. So this was an amazing thing in itself, and attests to the productivity of that society. Now, what did Southerners do with this great wealth? According to historian Frank, well, one thing they did was they educated their young people. Consider this. According to historian Frank Owsley, quote, "The South had more educated men and women in proportion to white population than the North or any part of the world," end quote. According to the 1860 census, there was one college student for every 247 white inhabitants in the South. One for every 247. In the North, it was one for every 703. Nearly 3 times as many Southerners went to college as did in the North. In 1836, Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia, was the first college in the world chartered to give women advanced degrees. The South's 260 colleges represented half the total of the United States. The South Carolina College Library had more books than Harvard in 1840. But even more impressive, a lending library next to that library had more books than the college library. Southern culture, unlike Northern, favored cosmopolitan education with emphasis on the classics. Many Southerners were educated in elite institutions of Europe and the North. Rich planters sent those, especially those of South Carolina, sent their sons to Eton, Oxford, and the Middle Temple. Of the 350 Americans admitted to the Inns of Court in London in 1860, nearly 2/3 were from the South. Northern schools such as Yale and Harvard had large contingents of Southerners. Calhoun was elected valedictorian of his class at Yale. Nearly half the students at Princeton in 1850 came from the South. This flourishing economy and society was destroyed root and branch by Lincoln's clumsy and ill-thought-out invasion and his later decision to turn war on civilians to win it. All told, the invasion and its aftermath and disease and the rest of it led to around 1 million deaths if civilians and slaves are counted. There's no way Lincolnian Americans can acknowledge any of this because what would you say? We engaged in an awful crime. I said earlier that Jeffersonian America under Southern leadership was the only regime in history where the central government of a modern state actually diminished over time in centralization. Okay. That was its character. It could do that, and did it. This hard decentralist principle, so important to the Jeffersonian mind, was carried over into the Confederate Constitution, which sought to bind Southerners themselves against their own temptation to centralization. The Lord's Prayer says, "Lead us not into temptation." And so the Confederate Constitution was a way of saying that prayer. May we not be tempted as they were. Well, let's look at some of those reforms. What did they do to bind themselves against crony capitalism? Southerners learned from their bad experience of the Union that the best way to prevent tyranny in the central government is to restrain its ability to raise and spend money. First, the Confederate Constitution required the high bar of a 2/3 vote of both houses before a spending bill could be put to a vote. Second, that's going to be hard to meet. Second, the bill had to be for one and only one item as stated in its title. This eliminated tacking on earmarks and pork spending, having nothing to do with the purpose of the bill. Third, bills to fund federal internal improvements such as railroads, canals, and so on were prohibited. These projects were to be funded by private enterprise and or the states. Fourth, the federal government could spend money to improve the means of commerce, such as building lighthouses and cleaning out harbors, but the government was to be reimbursed by a user fee. Fifth, federal contracts with cost overruns were prohibited. Sixth, the president was given the line item veto and a single 6-year terms. These reforms were explicitly designed to check the rise of Hamiltonian and Lincolnian crony capitalism. The Confederate Constitution also gave the states increased power to check federal tyranny. First, any state by a two-thirds vote of both houses could impeach any federal official operating within its borders to be tried in the Confederate Senate. This would put a little chilling water on federal judges. Second, and this is one of the most important reforms, any three states could initiate a constitutional amendment. Any three states. The ratification of which required only two-thirds of the states rather than the three-fourths required today. If we had this measure in place today, the states would have the final say on how to interpret the Constitution, not the Supreme Court or 9 politically well-connected lawyers. The Constitution does not give the Supreme Court authority over school prayer, abortion, gay marriage, law enforcement, and 100 other powers reserved to the states. Yet the court has usurped these powers based on nothing other than its own Alice in Wonderland reading of the 14th Amendment. Yeah, do you like Alice? I like reading the entrails of sheep. There's a right here between a new right. Third, new states could enter the Confederacy, but it required a two-thirds majority of both houses. Under the U.S. Constitution, a mere majority of Congress permits a new state to enter. This is destabilizing because new states create new majorities and new minorities. And this can severely harm important interests, especially in a huge colonial regime like the United States. It is a stupid rule, and it caused the war, really. You could argue it caused the war, because the quarrel was over Western territory. Consider the annexation of Texas. Being a foreign country, annexation required a treaty to be confirmed by two-thirds vote of the Senate. The treaty failed by a large majority in the Senate. So that's it. Texas is not going to come in. To get around this, Congress, by questionable constitutional maneuver, decided that a joint resolution by a simple majority of both houses would be sufficient. The measure passed by only 2 votes in the Senate. Northern leaders were understandably furious and saw this as a Southern grab for power. John Quincy Adams urged secession. Had the Confederate Constitution been that of the Union in 1843, Texas would never have been part of the United States because the North had enough votes for the foreseeable future to prevent a two-thirds majority of both houses of Congress. And that would have been a good thing. If Texas were an independent state today, it would have the 14th largest GNP in the world and could control its border with Mexico, which it cannot do as the plaything of Lincolnian Americanism. I turn now to Lincolnian Americanism itself. Having excluded state interposition in secession, the only remedy it offers to federal tyranny is a national election. That's it. That's it. That's your remedy to tyranny. Good luck. Well, national elections can serve as a remedy, but only if the people are adequately represented at the national level. So what is the proper ratio of population to representation? Well, Madison and many of the founders thought it was 1 representative in the House for every 30,000 people. That would be adequate representation. As population increased, the number of representatives should also increase. But by 1910, Congress capped representation at 435, where it is today. The population in 1910 was 92 million. Today it is 320 million, yielding a ratio of 1 representative for every 735,000, which is a meaningless ratio. Even worse, by mid-century, there might well be 435 million in the United States, which would yield a ratio of 1 representative in the House for every 1,000,000 persons. Write your congressman. Get involved. Right. In short, As population increases in Lincolnian America, the quality of representation diminishes. And that it diminishes every day. What to do? It will not do to increase the size of the House. Judged by lawmaking bodies around the world, 435 is about right. And if we increased it in accord with Madison's ratio of 1 for every 30,000 people, there would be 10,500 members in the House. Too big. But does this mean that Madison's ratio is wrong, or that the United States has grown simply too large for the purposes of self-government, and we should abandon the whole idea, or divide it? To fully understand how absurd our current ratio is, of 1 for every 735,000, imagine if that ratio were used by the first Congress, 1789, when there were around 4 million Americans. In that case, there would be only 5 members in the House. That's it. Which means that 5 states would have only 1 representative each. Well, that's not representation. But 8 states would have none. Now, that is exactly the quality of representation we have today. It's just that bad. Yet, bad as it is, this lack of representation in Congress is not the worst of it. For most of the laws we live under are not passed by Congress at all, but spring from the vast and impenetrable bureaucracy under the control of one man, the president. Nor is that all. Fundamental social policy regarding the place of religion in society, law enforcement, homosexual marriage, education, and the like are not decided in state legislatures, where the Congress places them, but by 9 politically well-connected lawyers. But there's even more. Once the Lincolnians removed the states as checks on central power, an enormous and ever-growing deposit of patronage was created in the central government, over which the people have no control, and the sheer size and scale of which is difficult even to comprehend. Consider this. A lawmaking majority of the House and Senate plus the President is only 269 people. If a quorum is used, it can be as low as 135. This small number rules some 320 million, a number 5 times as great as the Roman Empire. Last year, it spent nearly $4 trillion, an amount greater than the GDP of Germany. That small number spent more than the entire GDP of Germany. If you spend $1 million a day from the birth of Christ until today, you'll have spent only 700 billion, not a trillion. Yet since 2006, the central government has printed $4 trillion out of thin air and borrowed $9.4 trillion. Never in human history, never anywhere, has so much financial and political power been put in the hands of so few. The federal debt has reached $19 trillion, an amount greater than the empire's GNP. Recall now that when the Jeffersonians governed the United States, largely under Southern leadership, most Americans paid no direct federal taxes at all. And from 1835 to 1861, were almost free of any federal debt. That Jeffersonian America would have continued under the Confederacy in a more enhanced form. It existed, and it would have continued, perfected or enhanced under the Confederacy. But the federal debt is not the whole of it. According to Harvard economic historian Niall Ferguson, the United States has unfunded liability, including Social Security, Medicare, etc., that tops out at $238 trillion. Economist Larry Kolitoff places it at $220 trillion and says the U.S., quote, is arguably in worse financial shape than any other developed country, end quote. Now, to gain some perspective on the scale of this patronage and corruption, Consider that the GDP of all countries in the world combined last year was $72 trillion, about a third of the central government's estimated unfunded liability, if Ferguson and Kolitov are right. Whether they are or not, it doesn't matter. They are distinguished economists, and their view is worth considering. It is unlikely that Lincolnian national elections can restrain the momentum of centralization and crony capitalism that is built into the self-centralizing structure of Lincolnian Americanism. It is self-centralizing. The only remedy is to revive Jeffersonian America, where the people, through state interposition or nullification, gradually begin recalling those reserved powers they have allowed through absent-mindedness or corruption to slip out of their hands. By drawing the teeth of state sovereignty, Lincolnian America has created a regime that can define the limits of its own powers. An oligarchy can do that. Has created a vast, impenetrable democracy under the president, a vast and uncontrollable glut of patronage and debt, and has lost the knowledge of how to stop growing. That's what a cancerous cell does. It doesn't know how to stop growing. It is like an alcoholic or drug addict, and it cannot be fixed by Lincolnian national elections. These function only as enablers, which allow the addict to continue his bad habits. Do you want to be an enabler? What is needed is an old-fashioned family intervention, where the parents, the spouse, children, aunts, cousins, grandparents, priests, and friends intervene to bring the addict back to reality. In Jeffersonian America, that family intervention function belongs to the states. They are the aunts and uncles and family members. It is called state interposition or nullification, family intervention. The Jeffersonian vision, though suppressed, is still a vital force in America today. There's a 10th Amendment movement at work throughout the country. States are recalling their Jeffersonian inheritance and are debating intervention either through nullification or through state-initiated amendments to the Constitution. Indeed, and this is interesting, even the topic of secession is being revived despite the Lincolnian Pledge of Allegiance to one nation, indivisible. To give you an example, Public Policy Polling, a respected research institute, conducted a poll in December 2012 asking those interviewed whether they would like to see their state secede from the Union. Now notice at the centennial, no one would have ever thought of conducting such a poll. But it is thought of today. In the poll, 18% of Americans favored secession. But look at the breakdown. Of the 18 to 29-year-olds, 29% favored secession. 21% were not sure. Hispanics, 27% favored secession, 19% not sure. Blacks, 12% favored it, 16% not sure. Of those identified as very conservative, 37%. 37%. 15% not sure. Somewhat conservative, 23%. 18% not sure. Among very liberal, 13%, but 26% not sure. Somewhat liberal, 13%, 7% not sure. A quarter of Republican voters in the 2012 presidential election favored secession of their states. A Reuters Ipsos poll released September 19th, 2014, 2 years after the public policy poll just mentioned, found that an average of 25% of Americans favored secession of their states. That's over 80 million people. These polls are significant because they show the rapidly dwindling confidence in Lincolnian Americanism. As I said, such a poll would have been unthinkable in the centennial. In conclusion, Confederate symbols and monuments are the living historic embodiment of Jeffersonian America, a thing that actually existed from 1776 to 1861. This Jeffersonian vision is the only part of the American tradition that has the resources necessary to criticize the self-centralizing regime of crony capitalism and clumsy global imperialism that Lincolnian Americanism has unhappily become. In the culture war we are living through, many Confederate monuments may go down, but the Jeffersonian vision of America, to which they bore witness, is likely only to grow stronger, because we must remember, this Jeffersonian America was a feature of North and South. Thank you.